Hello, AP Government students. This is Mr. Martyrin with your Flip Classroom on Chapter 10, Elections and Voting Behavior. Now, Chapter 10 is important for you to read because it provides an overview, kind of a big picture of how elections are carried out and voting behavior plays out in the United States. In future chapters and conversations and discussions, we will go into the mechanisms of voting and elections. We will talk about and discuss what it takes to win an election and ultimately how candidates and elected officials will use elections to shape public policy. So there's different types of elections. Okay, it's just not the Tuesday in November that we think of. The first type of election that you need to be familiar with is what's called a primary election. And a primary election is where a political party will select their nominee. So, for example, in 2016, we had several Republicans run for the Republican nominee, and we had various primaries on different days. In the Democratic Party, we had Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders running. But again, they had to compete in different primary elections to figure out who was going to be the nominee. Once they are selected and win the nomination of their party, then that usually goes to a general election. And this is the election that we think of in November. Election night, whether it's a presidential election, gubernatorial election, congressional election, every year is an election year. In New Jersey, we just had a gubernatorial race. That's the off-year election. So this year, 2018, is going to be a congressional race. 2019 is going to be a quiet year. It's going to be state assembly, some state senate races. But then the following year, the fourth year of this cycle, 2020, is a presidential election year. Two other elections or ballot initiatives are what's called a referendum, and this is the state level of directing legislation that gives voters a chance to approve or disapprove things like a constitutional amendment. You will notice on if you've ever voted or seen a sample ballot, usually there's one or two questions at the bottom of that ballot, and that enables voters to decide directly on an issue. There's also what's called an initiative petition, and this you see in some states where it proposes changes to the state constitution, given a certain number of signatures. That actually is more common out in California, out west. We don't see it too commonly on the East Coast. All right, so the biggest election that you would need to concern yourself with is the election of 1800. Why is the election of 1800 important? It's known as the Revolution of 1800 because for the first time we have a peaceful transfer of power, but it's a peaceful transfer of power to an opposition party. When George Washington left the presidency, his successor John Adams was of the same party. So again, it was not a big deal. But 1801 was a big deal. John Adams left the White House, giving it to Thomas Jefferson of a different political party. There was no revolution, there was no gunfire, it was a very peaceful transfer of power. And one of the hallmarks of our democracy has been that there is this peaceful transfer of power. In the early 1800s, really all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt in the 1900s, it was common that if you were running for president, it was not looked upon for you to campaign. You know, it was actually frowned upon if you were actively campaigning for president. So you had surrogates. You had people go around and do the dirty work for you. You had people go around and conduct a whisper campaign. But the early elections of this country, it was, you know, people putting your name around, but it was not you going around. That changes with Andrew Jackson and later in the 20th century with Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley and all the rest. Campaigns, newspapers were incredibly partisan, so it's always interesting to hear people talk about, you know, Fox News or CNN or Breitbart. That is really has not changed since the 1800s. I mean, newspapers and news media are incredibly partisan. They would attack their opponents. Campaigns tended to focus not on the voters themselves, but the state legislatures, because after all, it is the state legislators that, you know, ultimately choose and vote in the Electoral College. And it was in this campaign that John Adams finished second after a couple electors in Pennsylvania and New York flipped their votes, giving it to Jefferson. 1896 was a pretty pivotal election. This is the Cross of Gold speech. William Jennings Bryan was the Democratic Party's nominee. He went up against William McKinley. Um, but this was what a lot of historians will consider as like the first modern presidential campaign. McKinley wins the election, and the Republicans regain majority status. 2004, fast forward now to 2004. This marks the true polarization of American politics. Believe it or not, and we have grown up in a time of where the Republicans have dominated the presidency, but Republicans have not controlled the White House for many years in the 20th century. George W. Bush becomes the fourth Republican to hold, since McKinley, to hold a consecutive term. If you think back to starting in the 20th century, Roosevelt finishes out McKinley's term. He serves a term and a half, and then it goes to Taft, who only serves one term. Then it's Woodrow Wilson for 2 terms. Then Warren Harding, who dies. Then Calvin Coolidge, who only serves one term. Then Herbert Hoover, who only serves one term before losing to FDR for 12 years. And then you have Truman. Then you have 8 years of Eisenhower, followed by Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. Nixon, unfortunately, resigns and doesn't serve his full term. Gerald Ford only serves 2 years as president. Ronald Reagan serves 2 full terms. And George Bush only serves 1 term. So the 20th century, believe it or not, has not been dominated by many Republican presidents. But the 2004 election really begins the polarization of the American presidency. We've seen this in the 1990s. The 2000 election was incredibly partisan. As we know, Florida was the key tipping point in that election. The 2004 campaign was characterized by a lot of negative campaigning, a lot of character attacks on both the Republican and Democratic sides. This also became the time where people focused on war and terrorism. And if you were not wearing the flag pin, so to say, you were not American. And if you were soft on terrorism, you were un-American. And if you questioned, American beliefs and doctrines, you were soft on terrorism. And again, just showing you the polarization of politics. 2004, the chart on the left-hand side of your screen versus 2008. You can see Barack Obama having a substantial majority in the Electoral College. We're going to talk a little bit more about Obama's election in 2008 because a lot of people felt that this was a transformational election. However, that doesn't become the case because a lot of the disenfranchised voters that voted for change in 2008 were looking at data that supports the idea that they also voted for change in 2016, which as a political scientist is quite extraordinary because you're wondering, how could someone who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 vote for Donald Trump in 2016? All right. As we know, suffrage is the right to vote. And it's important to understand that there have been more amendments in the Constitution to protect people's right to vote. The 15th Amendment extends African Americans the right to vote. The 19th Amendment extends women the right to vote. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators, giving, again, the people the right to vote. And then the 26th Amendment allows people over the age of 18 also the right to vote. Despite our efforts to increase electioneering in polls, the United States, as we discussed earlier, has the lowest voter turnout. A lot of people argue that it's the same stuff, just 2 different piles. A lot of people are indifferent to voting. A lot of people feel that regardless of who we vote for, it won't have a major difference on who holds office. Our vote doesn't matter. So there is a lot of apathy, but also it's interesting to see that a lot of people are voting or not voting out of protest. They're saying that, you know what, we can't get good qualified candidates. Neither of them deserve my vote. So that's always a political opinion. Political efficacy is the belief that one's political participation does matter. There was a race in Virginia, the Virginia House of Delegates, where it was decided it was a 50-50 tie. And this was just decided a couple weeks ago. It was decided by a coin toss. Your vote does matter. A lot of people, such as myself, think it's a civic duty in order to support a democratic government that a citizen should always vote. And a lot of us are of the opinion that citizens should be informed when we vote, but that's kind of the idea behind civic duty. And again, this is just a chart that we've gone over in class between 1892 and 2004. Voter turnout has declined tremendously. Tremendously. We're hitting about the 55, between 55 and 60% of our populace votes. You know, a lot of you guys would say, well, if you got 60% of a vote, you know, that's an overwhelming majority in an election. But that still leaves 40% of the country that are not voting for whatever reason. All right, some of the background. Registering to vote. This happens obviously when you turn 18. You get the driver's license. You can register to vote. That gives you unlimited power. Voter registration procedures differ by state. Some states you have to register 30 days before an election. Other states you can show up and register on the day of the election. This goes back to the Bill of Rights, where we talked about Articles 9 or the Ninth and Tenth Amendment giving states that power to regulate. And that's why some people are saying, well, why don't we have national election laws or national holidays for election day? And it's because that elections are the result of the state governments and the state legislatures. In 1993, the Motor Voter Act was passed. We talked about this with federalism. This requires states to permit people to register to vote when they get their driver's license, and that's a big opportunity for people to register to vote. All right, so who votes? We'll talk about that in our next video, but for now, if you need to go back and watch any of these videos again, go ahead. I'll talk about political participation in our next video.